Somewhere there's a child a-crying. Somewhere there's a child a-crying. Somewhere there's a child a-crying, crying for freedom in South Africa. Somewhere.
I come from a country where for the last 35 years, millions of South Africans have been suffering under a system called apartheid. Apartheid is a cancer on the body politic of the world, a scourge on our society and on all humankind. Apartheid exists only because of economic greed and political oppression maintained by both systemic and physical violence and a false sense of racial superiority. So many have been forced into exile. So many have been thrown into jail. Too many of our children have been shot down mercilessly on the streets of our nation.
For freedom in South Africa.
The struggle to overthrow apartheid took half a century. It was a global movement inspired by the liberation leaders of South Africa, who appealed to the world to join their struggle by economically sanctioning the South African regime.
Sanctions, and including divestment, these are the things that will make the South African government look anew at the situation in which we find ourselves.
Crying for freedom! Crying for freedom! Crying for freedom! Crying for freedom! I'm gonna take it!
I think right through the 80s, what we were doing was putting together the various forces, and there were many of them, that worked on the divestment and sanctions movement, and what we called a people's sanctions movement, because we had to build it at the base in order for it to impact on Congress.
Let us send the message to the rest of this country, to Congress. Sanctions have to be imposed. They have to be imposed now. Sanctions now. Sanctions now.
The investment of capital within South Africa contributed to the strength of that regime. And we could make a stand on our campus, in our community, and in our country to have the United States stop any level of support, to have corporations that we were connected to stop any level of support for South Africa.
We had tuition dollars that were invested into multinational corporations that then did business in South Africa. So indirectly, we were supporting the white-dominating, black-exploiting South African economy.
The tactic at these local and institutional levels was called divestment.
Divestment meant for an institution to sell its stock in any companies that had operations in South Africa.
It was an interesting campaign because people at the very local level actually had a lever to pressure companies.
Divestment was a way for us to take some control of our money and to pressure those companies to pull out of South Africa so that the South African government would find itself compelled to negotiate with the liberation movement.
This call for divestment spread across the country, from church groups to unions, but especially on college campuses.
There was no way one could turn away from the struggle in South Africa during that time, during that period, because so much was happening and it was in the face. You couldn't ignore it.
In the media, every day there seemed to be images of tear gas, seeing students, bullets flying, people getting injured.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Johannesburg, South Africa, Ted Koppel.
Today, at a place called Uitenhage, South African police opened fire on some 3,000 to 4,000 demonstrators. At least 17 are dead. The number is expected to rise.
It started as a funeral procession for 3 people shot and killed by police last week.
The police stayed there and hit him. And hit him, the police. There's a blood, you can see it yourself. It's a blood of, over there, over 3, there's many blood even here.
The Uitenhage massacre came 25 years to the day after Sharpeville, when another peaceful demonstration had been cut short by police gunfire. The coincidence did not go unnoticed.
Mrs. Mandela and I had just sat down to talk when we got news of the demonstrations and killings. For her, on this 25th anniversary of Sharpeville, it brought back a flood of memories.
This is what our leaders went to prison for, those 23 years ago. This confirms what we've been saying all along. There has been no change in this government.
I must be emphatic on this. I'm going to keep order in South Africa. And nobody in the world is going to stop me from keeping order.
Wafana yulindu timyantinya pesbintaba. Wafana yulindu timyan gaisema pesbintaba.
We need to convince the Board of Trustees, divest from companies that do business with South Africa.
Colombia's response to that was to say, thank you very much, but we're not going to do that.
Well, the early view on divestment was that it was counterproductive. And there was also concern about the endowment itself. And if divestiture would be damaging to endowment returns, tuition would rise, there'd be less money for financial aid and salaries.
And I said, I can't believe all of you. You know, people in South Africa are dying. You are justifying supporting apartheid.
And a majority of their trustees were on boards of these companies who were doing business in South Africa. So there was a real link to Colombia and the companies that were helping to support and institutionalize apartheid. And you have to respond. You have to respond to that. Decided to blockade the entrance to the main administration building of Columbia College, which was then called Hamilton Hall. We planned it for the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968. So we also made the connection to that movement.
The university has taken a firm position and has gotten a court order barring the demonstrations.
Violation of the order is punishable by fine or jail or both. It's in your best interest to leave this area.
And we were adamant, if South Africa is not a sovereign state, and we use sovereign's name, Columbia couldn't be a sovereign university.
Columbia pays the bills. Apartheid kills. Columbia pays the bills.
Columbia University students say they will defy a court order to end their protest against
the student blockade at Columbia University went into its 10th day.
Demonstrators at Columbia University are calling for a citywide march on the university tomorrow.
We did have the beginning feelings of a movement, and there was something that was happening, and it was around freedom and equality and ending oppression, and it gave the sense of what are we going to do to be part of that.
The students at Columbia University have provided us with a lead that we have to follow.
The outpouring around the country is tremendous. Time after time, people come here to talk to us at Columbia and to tell us your struggle has started struggle everywhere else.
More than 100 students were arrested tonight at Cornell University campus after taking over the school administration building. 200 anti-apartheid protesters resumed that occupation at Cornell today. Police resumed arresting them tonight.
We have to accept everything on your terms.
Do we have to accept everything on your terms?
No, I think there's a
sounds that way. It sounds that way. No, it does sound that way. It sounds very much that way.
Purdue University police arrested 22 people who refused to leave when their protest permit expired early this morning.
At the University of Illinois, 60 students were arrested at a meeting of school trustees.
Anti-apartheid protests at the University of California, Berkeley campus have mobilized thousands of students this spring. Rallies in front of the administration building seemed a throwback to the free speech demonstrations of the 1960s.
Berkeley students have a tradition of resistance to racism.
South Africa needs the investment
of the Western democracies led by America and the prestige of American universities. South Africa needs our investment for oxygen and our markets for carbon dioxide. The character of our nation is on trial. Today we show patriotism by fighting for justice.
There's a whole sense of African-American progressive political expression that had strong, unapologetic, courageous leaders who were actually making a difference.
How can we wave the flag as Americans based upon our democratic ideals and embrace apartheid?
I felt inspired and reminded of a conscience, that I had a conscience, that I had a role to play. And I also felt a connection with South Africa.
I stand here as a proud African woman, deeply concerned about my people.
We were going to be part of this struggle. And so that's when we set up camp outside the president's office in the quad at Stanford. And people slept out there for weeks, making our moral witness around Stanford cutting its ties to any companies that were investing in South Africa.
Hundreds of colleges and universities like Harvard and Yale refuse to divest.
We believe that the approach we're taking, which is the more difficult one of one-on-one dialogue and trying to make our own judgments, is more consistent with what we believe the people in South Africa in general would like.
Tonight, protesters are getting ready for bed and perhaps a run-in with campus police.
But they're going to have to come in with crowbars, they're going to have to untangle people, they're going to have to look like the police in South Africa to get us out of here.
Mississippi. I was raised in the South Bronx, so I come from a background where I've seen a lot of injustice. The movement gave me a chance to do something about it. It was like a vehicle to be part of a progressive cycle of change.
We felt a direct connection to the experiences of people in another country, in a country on the other side of the world. And so we drew a line from South Africa to Washington, D.C. to Stanford.
Thank you for caring so much that you were prepared to jeopardize your grades and good degrees because you are saying that there are things that are perhaps more important.
By the summer of 1985, dozens of universities had decided to divest, but Columbia and Stanford were not among them.
The students hoped their tactics would force a showdown at a May 17th Regents meeting, where divestment was the topic of the day.
And to those who fear that an American withdrawal would be followed by a chaos that would hurt Black South Africans the most, one can only ask what they think is happening in South Africa now.
Despite the ongoing brutality, the rebellion inside South Africa continued. So Prime Minister P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency, giving the government unlimited powers. The police could search any home without warrant. They could detain and interrogate anyone without filing charges. Mass funerals, a critical source of unrest, could only be held indoors for one person at a time. Within 4 days, the government had used its new powers to detain almost 700 people.
Control! But we must maintain control! We must maintain
Around the world, the evening news showed images of burning black townships. The state of emergency demolished any illusion that conditions in South Africa were improving. It changed minds everywhere.
Without the media, I believe that most people in the U.S. to this day would have seen the issue of South Africa come and go like issues of the world come and go without actually paying attention to it. The media really put some of the nails in the coffin of apartheid.
It became increasingly clear that the government, in fact, was becoming more, not less oppressive. And I called Desmond Tutu, and his position was very clear that divestiture was the course that black South Africans wanted Americans to follow.
I was getting ready to come back on school. I had moved back on campus, and I was walking down the street, and one of the other people who were in the coalition came up to me, I think it was Larry Townsend, and said, "Hey, Tony, did you hear? Did you hear? Did you hear?" I said, "What? What?" He said, "Columbia divested." I thought it was a joke. I really thought it was a joke. I said, "No way, no way." Having said that, on some days you have this sense that what you can do can change the world and that you actually got an institution to move like that.
Well, it did accentuate the pressure on other major universities, and they were not happy about that.
An entity of Columbia's stature could actually take that step. Then it gave less excuse to Stanford to not be able to do something. So I do believe that Columbia's divestment added momentum towards Stanford to get it to do the partial divestment that it ultimately did.
The student protests were the biggest the nation had seen since the Vietnam War protests of the 1960s, and succeeded in pulling hundreds of millions of dollars out of corporations doing business in South Africa. But the battle didn't end with the students.
The divestment movement seems to have very narrow goals. But actually, in pressing forward that demand, what we wanted to do was to support the movement for sanctions against South Africa and for all kinds of organizations and city governments to think about how were their funds being used to maintain the South African regime. The larger goal is to increase a sense of responsibility among people so they could look for ways in which they too were responsible and could act.
The involvement of the states and cities was very threatening to many companies because they did a lot of business with the states and cities.
The American Committee on Africa perhaps made its greatest impact in initiating the campaigns which then mushroomed.
I traveled endlessly. We didn't have much money and we had very few people on staff. At the very height of the sanctions campaign in the middle of the 80s, we had maybe 10 people.
It was a joy traveling around the country. Today, I think about how did I do all these things? And, how did I travel to all these places? And I was in awe of these people who'll never see South Africa, but believed in what we're trying to do. That is the miracle.
Certainly, the discussion of the linkage between our policies here and South Africa found a ready ear in now 7,000 black elected officials. And many of our politicians became the movers of resolutions and laws that prevented state governments and city governments from investing in any corporation that was tied into South Africa.
The best legislation, which we used as a model for several years afterwards, was in Massachusetts.
In 1979, Massachusetts Representative Mel King read a disturbing report. His state had more money invested in companies that did business in South Africa than in companies that did business in Massachusetts. King introduced a bill that would force the state's pension plan to divest. The bill failed. What Mel King needed was an ally, a white one.
It wasn't until Senator Jack Beckman became interested in the issue of South Africa that we had this breakthrough. We brought him to New York, to ACOA. We sat down with him and educated him about South Africa.
In 1980, Beckman and King joined with ministers, teachers, union leaders, and professors to form an umbrella coalition, Mass Divest.
Mass Divest was created to light up a fire under the legislators in the Mass House, to do the right thing. And so our role was to call press conferences, to have demonstrations, to promote the public awareness of the issues surrounding this bill.
When you're here, you're giving a message because you're saying we have enough of your involvement with racism in South Africa. We have enough, and we don't want this being done in our name.
The next year, King tried again, this time with Jack Bachman.
Jack Bachman invited me to the Senate, and I went up and spoke. The issue was whether a state had a right to interfere in foreign policy, because by taking an action on divesting from companies doing business in South Africa, that was supposed to be treading on the right of the federal government from being involved in foreign policy. But we argued that these were funds that belonged to the state, and the state had the responsibility to invest them in a manner that was better for the residents of the state.
In 1982, the Massachusetts legislature approved the bill.
We saw it through to the governor's desk. The governor at the time was Ed King. He vetoed it. King vetoed it. Why? Because a South African government lobby group had been to Boston, lobbied the governor, and he wouldn't sign the bill. We then had to go back to the House and get a 2/3 majority to overcome the veto, and we did. And that's how the bill passed, the first in the country.
$91 million were pulled out of companies doing business with South Africa. A combination of an African-American representative and a white senator had performed a legislative miracle.
The thing about America that's interesting, I have been involved in probably 40-odd states introducing legislation. Where it was white legislators on, because it never won. Where it was black legislators on, it never won. If you go look at all the states where that legislation won, it was always a white legislator and a black legislator co-sponsoring legislation. And this was, to me, the moral of what South Africa was going to be.
Just months after Massachusetts divested its pension plan, the divestment movement surfaced in New York City. The struggle there began with pineapples, cans of pineapples in a homeless shelter.
I had just started as the editor of the union newspaper, The Unionist. We represent public service workers in the shelters. One of our workers complained to the supervisor. These pineapples were imported from South Africa, and he didn't want to serve imported South African pineapples to the shelter clients. We promoted it through our union newspaper, and we brought the story to the New York Labor Committee. And that's when the bill got started. It wasn't some dry old bill, it was sort of a juicy pineapple.
Then there were people who said, no, this is not the right area in which for us to manifest our opposition to apartheid. We have other ways in which we should do that, but not by using our economic clout. And Mayor Koch was vocal on that position.
Mayor Koch said in his inimicable style, well, why don't we do a bill for Poland? Or why don't we do a bill for the Soviet Union?
With the powerful mayor in opposition, the pineapple bill began to lose momentum.
During this period, of course, the coverage of this issue grew exponentially. Every night there was another story about the coming together of the moral forces and the political forces and the economic forces to oppose South Africa's apartheid system. And ultimately, I think the American people were aroused to the immorality of any complicity by the United States.
The umbrella union that represents city workers of 125,000 members passed a resolution supporting the bill. Other unions passed resolutions. It was brought to New York State legislature. There was support all over the state for that particular bill. Eventually, Koch came around and was one of the people that took credit for it.
The mayor, the police commissioner, and the police union boss said today they've worked out plans to pull out $100 million worth of investments. They say it's part of a larger plan to eventually have all the city pension funds stop dealing with companies doing business in South Africa.
The next step, because it hadn't achieved its goal of getting the companies out of South Africa, was pushing for cities and states not to purchase from any company that was doing business in South Africa, what we called selective purchasing.
New York City was going to buy walkie-talkies, radios, and ordinarily the police department wanted to buy these instruments from the Motorola Corporation. And we said, consistent with this new policy we have, unless Motorola stops behaving as a lousy corporate citizen, we were going to take our business elsewhere. This demonstrates that we are having a material impact on American corporate policy in South Africa, and that in turn is unquestionably having an effect in Pretoria.
By April of 1985, thousands of city council members, state legislatures, and local officials all over the United States began to work for divestment. Dozens of anti-apartheid bills, resolutions, and ordinances ripped through city councils and state legislatures.
I don't think that we want to have city investments in a country that is so shaky in a political and a social sense.
Apartheid will change if good people in chambers like this all over this country do something now while we have the opportunity.
Through the streets of Newark they marched, church groups and union organizations, ordinary citizens, the largest human rights demonstration in New Jersey history.
Well, it's the law now. New Jersey is pulling out its pension funds from companies that operate in South Africa.
New Jersey's action is the strongest yet in terms of dollars, $2 billion to be phased out over the next 3 years.
We're here today because events in South Africa have simply run amok. And without our action, I don't believe that situation shows any sign whatsoever of changing.
The divestment bill was opposed by the New Jersey Business and Industry Association, citing a cost of about $65 million in investment fund losses. Governor Kane says the losses will be minimal, if that, and that the unions who stand to take whatever losses there will be asked him to sign the bill.
Last week, Kansas became the latest, joining 10 other states that have already enacted partial or total divestment.
If we had all 50 states, we will be getting closer to 20 or maybe even $25 billion. So it's a lot of money that is at stake.
During his visit to California, Bishop Tutu addressed a joint session of the California legislature.
You have an enormous responsibility. And we call on the international community, of which you are such an important constituent. Please, please, for goodness sake, help us. Help us exert pressure, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, but above all, economic pressure. Help us bring about this tremendous new society.
Within a year, California would divest, with the state forcing the entire University of California system to follow suit. A total of more than $11 billion.
I had a tremendous feeling of fruition as the campaigns which we had helped to get started were being supported so broadly. All of a sudden, it became the major campaign at a moment in history.
From Selma to Soweto,